Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you all, and congratulations to all the Grazia team on the 10th birthday. I can't believe that it's only been around for 10 years, actually, because you've made an incredible mark in that time. I'm really pleased to be here in excellent company. It's not often that I'm part of an all-woman panel, actually. So let me start by introducing everyone. Christina Lamb is a veteran foreign correspondent, best known now for the Sunday Times. Her work has really taken her to some of the toughest places on the planet, and lots of her books reflect that. Sue Turton is a correspondent and presenter for Al Jazeera, previously Sky, ITN, Channel 4 News for many years. She recently narrowly avoided being locked up in Egypt, along with some of her colleagues, and campaigned tirelessly for them for many, many months until they were happily released just a few weeks ago. Jayne Secker has been a presenter on Sky News since 2009 and again reported live from many places around the world. She was a correspondent for many years, reported on the Eurozone crisis and with the US military, I think, when the Iraq War began, and on the Arab Spring. And Emily Maitlis, my BBC colleague, it's very rare. Emily and I never get to see each other because we work at opposite ends of the day, so it's incredibly rare for us to be in the same room at the same time. Emily, of course, works on Newsnight. She's going to be very busy in the run-up to the election as one of the election presenters. She's worked on previous UK elections and US elections, been in Hong Kong recently for the protest there. Plenty to talk about. I wonder if I can start with actually asking all of you the same question. I'm just keen to know to what extent you envisaged where you would be now. How was it for you, Christina?
I didn't plan it at all. I wanted to write novels, actually, and I wanted to have adventures and travel the world. So actually I became a journalist at the beginning, but actually, as I'm sure the rest of the panel would testify, when you actually go to these places, you find that real life stories are actually much more interesting than anything you can make up. Actually, I had a very brief career as a TV reporter at Central News. The last story I ever did was a man who turned his car back to front, so it looked like it was going forwards when it was going backwards. Obviously, a great loss. A great loss.
Surely it exists. This is what YouTube's for. Surely someone must be able to find this.
So I was rescued from that because one day I came home from work and I got, there was an invitation to Benazir's wedding in Pakistan. So I went to her wedding and I just fell in love with Pakistan and thought it was going to be really interesting with her going back, taking on a military dictator, General Zia. So I came back and gave him my notice and my very brief TV career came to an end.
Sue, did you plan all this?
You know, at 14 I decided I was going to be a foreign correspondent. Sitting at school I went, that's what I want to do. But as these things happen, it never quite worked out that way. And I worked first for Sky 25 years ago, the first year Sky set up, and eventually ended up at Channel 4 News, which I had an amazing time, but didn't really manage to crack the foreign role. And then I got a call for somebody who was the wife of somebody that worked at Channel 4 News, who worked at Al Jazeera, and they went, how about a correspondent's job in Kabul, Gaza or Baghdad? Oh, I went, okay, yeah, you've got me there. And I'd never been to Afghanistan. I packed my bag and off I went, Afghanistan correspondent.
When was that?
That was 5 years ago.
Jayne?
Well, quite dull. I wanted to be a journalist since I was about that big. I wanted to write, I wanted to tell stories. I set my sights pretty low. It was the Morpeth Herald, my local paper. And when I left school at 18, I got a gig writing for them. So I did travelling and did travel writing for them. Those were in the days before computers when you had to phone in your copy from Australia. And I did that, went to university, and then I got taken on by the Beeb as a trainee in radio and worked for the Beeb and then worked my way up the conventional route, local news, regional news, and then was taken on by Sky in 2001. Within a year I was sent to Moscow to cover the theatre siege, and quickly after that it just spiralled. I did an awful lot from the Middle East. I was in Iraq during the war on one of the American ships on the night of shock and awe, watching the Tomahawks go off into the sky and then watching them hit Baghdad a couple of hours later on the ship's television, which was extraordinary. And I met my husband-to-be. I didn't know when I met this burly builder in a bar that I would end up 10 years later married with 2 kids. And a lot happened in those 10 years. A couple of years later, I was in Israel again, in Nahariya in the north, with fighting with Hezbollah. Got a bit too close to the action, and I didn't realise, but I had post-traumatic stress, and came back to the UK, had counselling, and decided that maybe I just needed to change the focus a bit. And at that point, presenting seemed like a much more sensible option. But I do miss it a little bit. I hear you guys talking and I thought, oh, it was such fun, it was so exciting.
Emily, you had a stint recently as Newsnight's political editor, and now you're back in the presenter's chair in time for the election.
Yeah, I never wanted to be a journalist. I never envisaged myself being a journalist. I was committed to being a hairdresser when I was 14. My parents had a heart attack because I was working as a Saturday girl at the local hairdresser. And then they gave me a job. It was fantastic. And I said, I'm going to be there. And actually, I became a journalist weirdly by default. I left the UK. I took a job in Hong Kong. Told my mum I'd be there for 6 weeks. And 6 years later, I was still sort of, doing stuff and exploring. And my first job was in radio. And I was the world's worst radio reporter. And actually getting to TV was a blessed relief, because there's somebody who does all the complicated stuff for you. There's a cameraman, and in the olden days there used to be sound people as well who would actually help you. And it was great not to be the one that was sort of holding the mic and pulling the wire and leaving the thing on the bus and muffling the sound and all the rest of it. So I'm slightly in awe of Christina and people who kind of go and write, and it's all your thing, because in a funny way, television it's more collaborative. It can be somebody else's fault too. That's that's what I'm really trying to say.
But actually, was it? I can't remember. Was it you, Sue, who said you remembered phoning in your copy? I mean, it strikes me that it strikes me that in these 10 years, technology has changed so much about the way that we do our jobs. What was it like when you started out?
Yeah. Well, when I started out, I first was based in Mishal, and there was no direct dialing telephones even. So even to phone in copy, you had to call the operator, and then you usually had to bribe them, basically. And I remember the night that General Zia was killed in this mysterious plane crash. And then I couldn't get through to my office in London. I was desperately calling the operator and begging her to put this call through. Finally, when we got a connection, we kept the line open for hours because we were so frightened we'd never get it again. So it was a massive telephone bill. And I remember getting the very kind of grizzled old foreign news editor at the FT who'd been in Vietnam, actually, and he said to me, sit down, have a cigarette, and take a deep breath, and then you've got to write like 5 stories. And
well, but now you can be live from any field, courtesy of basically what's in a backpack.
No, you can. I mean, I remember being based up north for GMTV, was a North of England correspondent, and this was before we had mobile phones. And I remember there was one red sort of telephone box in the middle of a village where I think there'd been a baby snatch or whatever, and there was a queue of journalists about 12 long, and Nigel Bouquet, who worked for the BBC, was doing like 5 BBC outlets. Who'd be doing Newsbeat, where he'd be upbeat and blah, blah, blah. Then he'd do Radio 4 and he'd be very dour and blah, blah, blah.
Radio 4 can have its, lively moments as well.
The money was going in the slot as fast as he could push it in, and the rest of the journalists were kind of banging on the door saying, we've got a file as well. But that was before we had the ability. Yeah. But the loveliness about that was that often the news desk couldn't get hold of you.
Yeah.
So you could disappear.
Also, you had more time to think about things. So you got things. I mean, now lots of things, people just say things straight away, and then later they turn out to be completely wrong. And that happened much less, I think, before.
Yeah, there was a really chilling moment, actually, with a colleague of mine. We were both covering the Paris attacks, the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attacks, and I'd been doing it for Newsnight in the Place de la République, and he was there on the Friday covering the moment when the supermarket, you remember the siege around the supermarket, and he realised, I mean, this is all to do with technology, that the people that were watching his report were the terrorists themselves, and actually he'd inadvertently started giving away details which they might not necessarily know, and of course we now know there are all those people that were hidden in the turned off freezer below. And he said, I had this chilling moment where I'd been talking, I suddenly started looking at Twitter, and I started looking at the feed, and I thought, what if I've just, caused the death of the 5 people that I've just been reported are hiding in there. And
that was so apparent in the Libyan war, because a lot of the time we would be going live from the front line. And we would know that the Gaddafi lot were watching Al Jazeera. So we'd do a live from some, mound somewhere where the fighting was going on, and then we'd move because we would worry. Now, our colleagues at Al Jazeera Arabic would just stick down and they'd stay there for like 6 lives, and the bombs and the bullets had just come flying because they knew they were giving information away as to where they were. And you become part of the front line. You're no longer just reporting.
Yeah. But it does also give you opportunities. Like also with Alice Crawford, with the fall of Tikrit, she was reporting for Sky, and they were on the back of a pickup truck. And because of new technology, they were essentially using a sat phone and the cigarette lighter of the truck to power it. And this extraordinary footage for hours and hours, travelling with the troops, getting into the town, and we were broadcasting it live. And that, it's never been done before, and that is purely because of the technology. It's because somebody had the nous to think we can do this, and we'll
producer with the B gun following the satellite.
Yeah, exactly. He was every time the car went around a corner, he was turning the B gun to kind of stay with the satellite. So new technology has changed what we do, in sometimes for the worse, but so many times for the better as well.
But
I think.
when you were talking about being in 2006 in Israel during the war with Hezbollah, was there a moment that you knew you didn't want to do that anymore?
No, I was really. We got there and we just literally landed at the airport, got in a car and drove. And as we got there, a bomb came in, it landed right beside our car. And then on the third day, we moved down to Haifa, and they were coming in closer and closer. And they tended to come in threes. And the first 2 landed, and we ran, and there was nowhere really to run. And I remember thinking, I'm about to die. Oh, bollocks. And I started, I'm not religious, and I started praying. And I remember thinking, I'm about to die, and I'm at work, and I haven't had kids. Oh, bugger. And it was just... It was at that moment I thought the game's up. I'd been in dodgy situations, I'd been in Gaza and I'd been shot at, and I'd come out with a broken leg, and I never felt vulnerable. I felt invincible. But on that one story, for some reason, something flipped, and we all just felt unsafe, and it was time to go.
Christina, you've written about being under fire in Afghanistan, I think when you were embedded with the Marines? With 3-Para.
Yes. Well, I mean, first of all, I think that just as technology has changed enormously, the job's become much more dangerous. We were not targets in the way that we are now. I mean, we're more targets than soldiers are, because, sad to say, but... a soldier being killed somewhere is not even making a paragraph in the news anywhere, whereas a journalist being killed is headlined. So the wonderful Sunday Times, after I'd almost got killed being embedded with the 3-Para, then said to me, what about getting embedded with Taliban? I said, well, I think there's a slight problem with that, in that they might decide I look better on one of their videos with a knife across. So I refused to do it. But honestly, that case, I mean, I was the first journalist to be embedded with our combat troops in Helmand. At that time, nobody thought it was a war. Everybody was still talking about it as a reconstruction project, and famously, not a single shot was going to be fired. So I went out with these 45 paratroopers that afternoon. Most of them weren't even wearing helmets, and we went into a village. And we were like we were going on a picnic. We were all kind of, what's going to happen? And there were so many signs that things were wrong. And actually, I felt stupid afterwards, because I realised I'd spent years going to Afghanistan, and I knew those signs. And actually, the soldiers had never been in an Afghan
Things like no one
before.
served you tea.
Yeah, we weren't offered tea. There was no children around.
Yeah.
There were a lot of things that I should have picked up on, and I would have done if I'd been on my own. But because I was with all these armed soldiers, I kind of didn't.
I want to ask, again on this sort of subject of changing landscape, should the next generation think in terms of a career, or is it about building the sort of skills that enable you to move with the times, whether it's between networks, between print and broadcast?
I think one of the things, I would go back to the skills. The skills now I'm so grateful to have from journalism are the very simple things, like I don't procrastinate as much, which sounds really weird, but if I have to write something, I've learnt to write very quickly. If somebody says, there's a deadline, blah, 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 I can just get things done.
I think the other thing it does, and I think it's the greatest profession in the world, if anybody's thinking about doing it, don't think twice. But I think the other thing it does, it teaches you that you can tackle anybody. It doesn't matter who they are. If there's something that you need to find out from them, if there's something that you think that maybe they need to answer for, you suddenly, become a bit more puffed up chested and say, okay, I can take you on, and I'm going to ask you this question. And as a journalist, you feel you don't just speak for yourself, that all the people that might watch you or read you or listen to you are asking the same question. And, you know, that's an incredible profession to have, really.
It's a real privilege. It's like that time when you're sitting in the car listening to the radio and you want to go, no, you haven't answered the question. Answer the question. No, why? And you can actually do that. You can actually just keep picking away at it, and that's a real privilege.
Yeah, I hope I never actually get over the thrill of this, but turning around in the Today studio and seeing who's waiting, you know, behind the glass. You know, this morning, most of them are clever enough not to be seen biting their fingernails. But you know, this morning turning around and seeing George Osborne and Nigel Farage not at the same time behind, you know, not sitting together behind the glass. But it is, you know, the access you have, but you only have that because of the trust people place in you, and you know that's never to be forgotten. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Grazia, for bringing us all together. Thank you.